The phone rings in the Oval Office at 6:47 a.m. on January 21st, 1998. President Bill Clinton, still in his pajamas, answers with the casual confidence of a man who has survived more political scandals than most presidents see in 2 terms. But the voice on the other end belongs to his chief of staff, Erskine Bowles, and it's shaking in a way that makes Clinton's blood turn to ice water. "Mr. President," Bowles says, his voice barely above a whisper, "we have a problem. The Washington Post is running a story tomorrow morning about you and a White House intern named Monica Lewinsky. They're saying you had an affair. They're saying you told her to lie about it under oath." Clinton sits down heavily on the edge of his bed, still holding the phone, watching the early morning light filter through the windows of the most powerful office in the world. Somewhere in the back of his mind he can hear the sound of his presidency beginning to crack like ice under pressure. Because Bill Clinton knows something that Erskine Bowles doesn't know yet, something that will make this scandal infinitely worse than anyone can imagine. The affair happened, all of it, and there's a blue dress with evidence that could prove it. For the next 8 months, America will watch as the most powerful man in the world lies, deflects, passes the meaning of simple words, and ultimately crumbles under the weight of his own appetites. It will be a masterclass in how personal weakness can topple political empires. And it all started with a 22-year-old intern who kept a souvenir. But to understand how we got to that moment, that phone call that would define a presidency and reshape American politics forever, we need to go back to the beginning, back to a small town in Arkansas where a boy named Billy Blythe learned that charm could get you almost anything, and that almost anything was never quite enough. Tonight we begin with the remarkable life and complicated path of William Jefferson Clinton, the 42nd President of the United States, whose insatiable appetites for both power and pleasure would ultimately teach America that even the most gifted politicians are still at their core deeply flawed human beings. From his humble beginnings in Hope, Arkansas, to the most humiliating presidential scandal in modern history, Clinton's story is one of soaring triumph and spectacular self-destruction, often happening simultaneously. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your story begins on August 19th, 1946, in a place called Hope, Arkansas. And yes, that's really the name of the town, Hope, as if the universe was setting up the most obvious political slogan in history from the moment Bill Clinton drew his first breath. You could practically hear future campaign managers weeping with joy at the poetic possibilities. The man from Hope. It writes itself, doesn't it? But Hope, Arkansas in the 1940s wasn't exactly a breeding ground for presidential ambition. It was a small southern town of about 8,000 people, where the biggest excitement might be a traveling carnival setting up in the town square, or rumors that someone famous had been spotted at the Dairy Queen. The kind of place where being born would normally guarantee you a life of predictable anonymity, maybe a job at the local bank, marriage to your high school sweetheart, and Sunday dinners that taste exactly like your grandmother's. William Jefferson Blythe III, however, was destined for neither predictable nor anonymous. His father, William Jefferson Blythe Jr., was a traveling salesman who died in a car accident 3 months before Bill was born. The elder Blythe was driving home from Chicago when his car ran off the road near Sixton, Missouri, and flipped into a drainage ditch. He was thrown from the vehicle and drowned in 2 feet of water, unable to free himself from the wreckage. It was the kind of random, senseless tragedy that shapes a child's understanding of the world before they're even aware they have an understanding to shape. This meant our future president entered the world already carrying the weight of loss and abandonment, themes that would echo through his entire life like a melancholy soundtrack playing just beneath the surface of his relentless charm and ambition. His mother, Virginia Dell Cassidy, was barely 23 years old when she became a widow. She was a vivacious woman with dreams bigger than Hope, Arkansas could contain, but suddenly she found herself alone with a newborn baby and no clear path forward. Virginia was studying to become a nurse anesthetist, one of the few medical careers open to women in the 1940s, but raising a child alone while pursuing a demanding education was like trying to juggle flaming torches while riding a unicycle, so she made a decision that would profoundly shape her son's early life. She left baby Bill with her parents, Eldridge and Edith Cassidy, and moved to New Orleans to complete her nursing training. For the first 2 years of his life, Bill Clinton was raised by his grandparents in a small house on Hervey Street, learning his first lessons about love, loss, and the complicated ways families piece themselves together when life falls apart. Eldridge Cassidy ran a small grocery store and was, by all accounts, a gentle man who treated his grandson like the son he'd never had. Edith Cassidy was a practical woman who read to young Bill constantly, teaching him that books were doorways to worlds far beyond the borders of Hope, Arkansas. They were kind, stable, loving grandparents who gave him the emotional foundation he would need for the chaos that was coming. Because when Virginia returned from New Orleans in 1948, she brought with her not just a nursing degree, but also a new husband. Roger Clinton Sr. was a Buick dealer from nearby Hot Springs, Arkansas, a man whose charm was matched only by his capacity for self-destruction. He drank too much, gambled too much, and had the kind of volatile temper that could turn a family dinner into a battlefield without warning. Roger Clinton wasn't physically abusive, but he was what polite people might call difficult, and what honest people would call a mean drunk who made everyone around him miserable. He would disappear for days on gambling binges, come home reeking of whiskey and cigarettes, and fill the house with the kind of tension that makes children learn to read adult moods, the way sailors read storm clouds. Young Bill, now calling himself Billy Clinton after his stepfather legally adopted him, learned his first crucial life skill in that house: how to charm his way out of dangerous situations. When Roger was drunk and angry, Billy would deploy his smile, his quick wit, his ability to deflect tension with humor. He became a master of reading the room, of knowing exactly what people wanted to hear, and delivering it with such sincerity that they forgot they were being managed. It was a survival skill that would serve him well in politics, but it came at a cost. Because when you learn that charm is your shield against chaos, you never quite learn how to stop performing, how to just be yourself without calculating the effect you're having on others. The family moved to Hot Springs when Bill was 7, and if Hope had been small-town America, Hot Springs was small-town America with a twist. It was a resort town built around natural mineral springs, a place where tourists came to soak in healing waters and engage in activities that were technically illegal but practically tolerated. Gambling, prostitution, and general moral flexibility were part of Hot Springs' charm, and the local authorities had developed an impressive ability to look the other way when money was changing hands. For a boy learning to navigate the complicated relationship between public respectability and private appetites, Hot Springs was like a graduate-level course in moral ambiguity. Here was a place where the mayor might publicly support family values while privately taking kickbacks from casino operators, where the police chief could deliver stirring speeches about law and order while his officers were on the payroll of local bookmakers, where everyone understood that what you said in public and what you did in private were two entirely different things, and success belonged to those who mastered that distinction. Bill Clinton absorbed these lessons like a sponge. He learned that rules were often more like suggestions, that authority figures could be hypocritical, and that the key to thriving in such an environment was to be charming enough that people wanted to help you succeed, even when they knew you were bending the rules. At Hot Springs High School, Bill became everything at once: student council president, band member, class clown, academic star, and social chameleon who could fit in with any group. He was the kind of teenager who could spend first period discussing Aristotle with the honors students, second period jamming with the jazz band, third period charming the cheerleaders, and lunch period mediating disputes between rival cliques. He had an almost supernatural ability to make everyone feel like they were his best friend, like he understood them in ways no one else could. But even then, there were hints of the appetites that would later define and nearly destroy his presidency. Bill Clinton wanted everything: every girl's attention, every teacher's approval, every possible activity and achievement and experience that high school could offer. He had the kind of hunger that couldn't be satisfied, only temporarily appeased. His mother Virginia watched her son's social virtuosity, with a mixture of pride and concern. She recognized in him the same charm that had attracted her to Roger Clinton, but also the same restless appetite that made Roger incapable of being satisfied with what he had. She worried that Bill's gift for making people love him was also a compulsion, that he needed constant admiration the way other people needed air. She wasn't wrong. By his senior year, Bill Clinton had already developed the pattern that would define his entire life: spectacular public success, shadowed by private behavior that could destroy everything he'd built. He was class president, National Merit Scholar finalist, boys state delegate, and the most popular student in school. He was also already lying to girlfriends, manipulating teachers, and learning that his charm could get him out of almost any trouble. Almost any trouble, but not all trouble, as he would eventually discover. In the summer of 1963, Bill Clinton went to Washington, D.C., as part of the American Legion's Boys Nation program. It was a mock government exercise where high school students from across the country would play at being senators and representatives for a week. For most participants, it was a fun civics lesson. For Bill Clinton, it was a religious experience. On July 24, 1963, the Boys Nation delegates were invited to the White House to meet President John F. Kennedy. The photograph of that meeting shows a 16-year-old Bill Clinton pushing his way to the front of the group, reaching out to shake hands with the most powerful man in the world. The look on young Clinton's face is one of pure hunger, not just admiration or excitement, but actual hunger, as if he's staring at something he plans to devour. Later, Clinton would claim that meeting JFK was the moment he decided to enter politics. But looking at that photograph, it seems more accurate to say that meeting JFK was the moment politics decided to enter him. The presidency didn't just become his goal, it became his obsession, his identity, his reason for existing. From that moment forward, every decision Bill Clinton made was calculated to advance his political career. Which college to attend? Georgetown, because it was in Washington, D.C. Which graduate program to pursue? Oxford, because it was prestigious and international. Which law school to choose? Yale, because it produced presidents. Even which girls to date became partly political calculations. Not entirely, because Clinton was genuinely attracted to smart, accomplished women. But there was always an element of strategic thinking, always the question of how any relationship might help or hurt his long-term political prospects. At Georgetown University, Clinton majored in international affairs and quickly established himself as the most politically connected student on campus. He worked part-time for Senator J. William Fulbright of Arkansas, which gave him access to the inner workings of Washington power. He learned how legislation was really made, how deals were cut, how favors were traded. More importantly, he learned how to network, how to collect people the way other students collected books. Clinton's professors at Georgetown remember him as brilliant but restless, a student who could master any subject but who seemed more interested in people than in academic achievement for its own sake. He had the kind of intelligence that was practical rather than theoretical, focused on understanding how to get things done rather than on abstract principles. But it was also at Georgetown that Clinton's appetites began to complicate his carefully planned ascent to power. He dated multiple women simultaneously, often lying to each about the others. He developed a reputation as someone who could charm his way into any woman's affections, but who had trouble staying faithful once he'd succeeded. His roommates described him as insatiable, not just sexually but emotionally. He needed constant validation, constant attention, constant proof that he was loved and admired. When Clinton won a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford University in 1968, it should have been the crowning achievement of his undergraduate career. Instead, it became the first major scandal of his political life, a preview of how his personal appetites would repeatedly threaten his public ambitions. The Vietnam War was raging, and like many young men of his generation, Clinton was facing the prospect of being drafted into military service. Unlike many of his peers, however, Clinton had political ambitions that would be destroyed by either serving in an unpopular war or by openly opposing it. He needed to find a way to avoid military service without appearing unpatriotic, to take a principled stand without actually taking any stand at all. His solution was characteristically clever and morally ambiguous. He used his Rhodes Scholarship as a deferment, then enrolled in the ROTC program at the University of Arkansas Law School to maintain his draft status, then returned to Oxford without ever actually attending Arkansas or serving in ROTC. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic manipulation, threading the needle between competing obligations in a way that satisfied none of them completely, but avoided the worst consequences of any. But in December 1969, when the draft lottery was held and Clinton drew number 3111, making it unlikely he would ever be called to serve, he wrote a letter to the head of the Arkansas ROTC program that would haunt him for the rest of his political career. In that letter, he essentially admitted that he had manipulated the system to avoid the draft while maintaining his political viability. "I came to believe that the draft system itself is illegitimate," he wrote. "No government really rooted in limited parliamentary democracy should have the power to make its citizens fight and kill and die in a war they may oppose, a war which even possibly may be wrong, the kind of war which is not a war of survival." It was a thoughtful, articulate statement of principle. It was also political suicide for anyone planning to run for office in Arkansas, a state where military service was considered a prerequisite for public trust. Clinton knew this when he wrote the letter, but he was young enough to believe that he could talk his way out of any problem, charm his way past any scandal. He was mostly right, but not entirely right, as he would discover 3 decades later when the letter surfaced during his first presidential campaign. At Oxford, Clinton studied politics, philosophy, and economics, but his real education was in the art of being American abroad. He was charming, energetic, and endlessly curious about the world beyond Arkansas. His fellow Rhodes Scholars remember him as someone who could discuss Marx and Keynes with equal fluency, who could debate the finer points of constitutional law and then shift seamlessly to analyzing the latest pop music trends. But they also remember him as someone who seemed to be constantly performing, constantly calculating the effect he was having on others. Even in private conversations, Clinton appeared to be practicing for some future audience, as if every interaction was a dress rehearsal for a political career that everyone knew was coming. When Clinton returned to the United States in 1970 to attend Yale Law School, he was 24 years old and already one of the most promising young politicians in Arkansas. He had the perfect resume: Georgetown, Oxford, Yale. He had the perfect background, small-town boy who'd made good. He had the perfect story, overcoming tragedy and poverty through hard work and intelligence. What he didn't have was self-control. At Yale, Clinton met the woman who would become both his greatest political asset and his most perceptive critic, Hillary Rodham. She was brilliant, ambitious, and from the moment they met, she understood exactly what Bill Clinton was and what he was capable of becoming. She saw his extraordinary political gifts, but she also saw his extraordinary personal weaknesses. Their courtship was like a political negotiation conducted through personal attraction. Hillary was one of the few women Bill had ever met who was as ambitious as he was, who understood politics as well as he did, who could match his intellectual firepower and challenge his assumptions. For perhaps the first time in his life, Clinton was with someone he couldn't simply charm into submission. Hillary, for her part, was attracted to Clinton's obvious political potential, but also to his genuine warmth and intelligence. She had grown up in an emotionally cold household, where achievement was valued above affection. Clinton offered her something she'd never experienced: unconditional emotional generosity, the feeling of being completely accepted and adored. But even then, Hillary understood that loving Bill Clinton meant accepting his compulsions along with his gifts. She knew about his other relationships, his inability to be faithful, his need for constant validation from women. She made a calculated decision that his political potential was worth the personal cost, that she could manage his appetites well enough to keep them from destroying his career. It was a decision that would define both of their lives and, eventually, reshape American politics. After graduating from Yale in 1973, Clinton returned to Arkansas with a plan that was breathtaking in its ambition and precision. He would run for Congress in 1974, serve a few terms to establish his credentials, then run for governor, then use the governor's mansion as a launching pad for the presidency. It was a 20-year plan executed with the kind of discipline usually reserved for military campaigns. But first, he had to win that congressional race, and his opponent was John Paul Hammerschmidt, a popular Republican incumbent who had never faced a serious challenge. Clinton was 28 years old, unknown outside of academic and political circles, and running in a district that had never elected a Democrat to Congress. He should have lost by 20 points. Instead, he came within 4,000 votes of winning, a performance so impressive that it established him overnight as the most promising young politician in Arkansas. The loss was almost better than a victory would have been, because it proved Clinton could compete at the highest level without actually giving him a platform that might expose his inexperience. 2 years later, he ran for Attorney General of Arkansas and won without opposition. It was a stepping stone position, a way to establish statewide name recognition without having to take controversial stands on difficult issues. Clinton used the office to travel constantly, speaking to civic groups, attending church suppers, shaking hands at factory gates. He was building a political organization, one handshake at a time. In 1976, at the age of 30, Bill Clinton was elected governor of Arkansas. He was the youngest governor in the nation, a media darling who appeared on the covers of magazines as the embodiment of the New South. He was articulate, charming, intelligent, and seemingly destined for national politics. He was also completely unprepared for the realities of governing. Clinton's first term as governor was a disaster. He raised car license fees to fund highway improvements, which infuriated voters who saw it as taxation without representation. He filled his administration with young, Ivy League-educated staffers who looked down on Arkansas voters as unsophisticated rubes. He pursued an ambitious agenda of government reform that most people didn't understand and didn't want. Worst of all, he appeared arrogant and out of touch, more concerned with impressing national media than with serving the people who had elected him. The boy wonder from Hope had forgotten the most basic rule of Arkansas politics. You can't lead people who don't think you understand them. In 1980, Clinton was defeated for re-election by Frank D. White, a Republican businessman who ran on the simple platform that Bill Clinton was too big for his britches. It was a humiliating loss, a public rejection that shattered Clinton's carefully constructed image as the inevitable future president. For most politicians, losing a re-election campaign would be the end of their career. For Bill Clinton, it was the beginning of his education in the art of political resurrection. The defeat taught Clinton lessons he would never forget. He learned to listen before talking, to appear humble, even when he felt superior, to make voters feel heard and understood. He learned that policy expertise meant nothing if you couldn't communicate with ordinary people, that intelligence was useless without empathy. Most importantly, he learned how to apologize. Clinton's comeback campaign in 1982 began with a television ad in which he looked directly into the camera and said, "My daddy never had to whip me twice for the same thing." It was brilliant political theater, acknowledging his mistakes while promising to do better. Arkansas voters, impressed by his humility and charmed by his obvious remorse, gave him a second chance. Clinton won the 1982 gubernatorial election by a wide margin, beginning a political comeback that would eventually take him all the way to the White House. But the loss had also taught Clinton something more dangerous, that he could survive almost any scandal, overcome almost any setback, charm his way out of almost any trouble. It was a lesson that would serve him well for the next decade, and then nearly destroy him when he reached the presidency. During his second stint as governor, Clinton established himself as one of the most effective state executives in the country. He reformed Arkansas's education system, modernized its economy, and recruited businesses from around the world to invest in the state. He was pragmatic rather than ideological, willing to work with anyone who could help Arkansas prosper. He was also refining the political skills that would make him one of the most formidable campaigners in American history. Clinton had an almost supernatural ability to connect with voters, to make them feel like he understood their problems and shared their values. He could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with a room full of supporters, each convinced that they had formed a personal connection with him. But Clinton's personal life remained chaotic. He had married Hillary Rodham in 1975, and their relationship was both a passionate love affair and a political partnership. Hillary served as Bill's closest advisor, his toughest critic, and his most effective advocate. She was also increasingly his alibi, because throughout the 1980s, rumors swirled around Clinton about extramarital affairs. He was frequently seen in the company of women who weren't his wife, often in circumstances that suggested more than professional relationships. The Arkansas media, small and generally supportive of Clinton, largely ignored these rumors, but they were building like storm clouds on the horizon of his political future. Clinton's appetites weren't limited to women. He also had an insatiable hunger for political advancement, and by the mid-1980s, he was already planning his presidential campaign. The plan was to run in 1988, riding the wave of his success as Arkansas governor into the national spotlight. But first he needed a national platform, and in 1988, he got one in the most humiliating way possible. Clinton was chosen to give the nominating speech for Michael Dukakis at the Democratic National Convention, a prime-time opportunity to introduce himself to the American people as a rising star in the party. Instead, he delivered a rambling, boring, seemingly endless speech that put the convention audience to sleep and made him a national laughingstock. The speech was supposed to last 15 minutes. It went on for 32 minutes, with delegates shouting, "Get the hook," and laughing at Clinton's obvious discomfort. The only applause came when Clinton said, "In closing," which became the most quoted line of the entire convention. It was another humiliating setback, but Clinton turned it into an opportunity. He appeared on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, where he poked fun at himself and charmed the audience with his self-deprecating humor. Once again, he had transformed a potential career-ending disaster into a demonstration of his resilience and humor. The failed convention speech convinced Clinton to postpone his presidential ambitions until 1992. It was a decision that would prove crucial, because 1992 turned out to be the perfect year for a candidate with Clinton's particular combination of gifts and flaws. The Cold War was ending, the economy was struggling, and voters were looking for change. George H.W. Bush, despite his foreign policy successes, seemed out of touch with domestic concerns. The Democratic Party was hungry for a candidate who could win, and Clinton appeared to be their best hope. But first he had to survive the scandals that had been building around him for years. In January 1992, just weeks before the New Hampshire primary, a woman named Jennifer Flowers held a press conference claiming that she had conducted a 12-year affair with Bill Clinton while he was governor of Arkansas. She had audio recordings of phone conversations that seemed to support her claims, and she was willing to provide explicit details about their relationship. For most presidential candidates, such allegations would be campaign-ending, but Clinton and Hillary appeared together on 60 Minutes immediately after the Super Bowl, reaching the largest possible television audience, and delivered a performance that redefined American political scandal management. Clinton didn't deny the allegations outright, but he didn't confirm them either. Instead, he acknowledged that his marriage had been through difficult times, that he and Hillary had worked through their problems, and that they were stronger for the experience. He managed to appear both contrite and defiant, admitting to general imperfection while denying specific wrongdoing. Hillary's performance was even more crucial. She stood by her husband not as a victimized wife, but as a political partner, making it clear that she knew about his past indiscretions and had chosen to forgive them. Her presence legitimized Clinton's candidacy, suggesting that if his wife could accept his flaws, perhaps voters could too. The strategy worked. Clinton finished second in New Hampshire, calling himself the comeback kid, and rode that momentum through the Democratic primaries to win the nomination. The Jennifer Flowers scandal, which should have destroyed his campaign, instead became evidence of his resilience and his ability to survive political attacks. But the 1992 campaign also revealed the darker side of Clinton's approach to scandal management. His team engaged in what they called opposition research, but what might more accurately be called character assassination. They investigated Flowers' personal life, her financial problems, her past relationships, and used that information to undermine her credibility. It was a pattern that would be repeated throughout Clinton's presidency. When faced with accusations of personal misconduct, attack the accusers, question their motives, investigate their backgrounds, and make the story about their credibility, rather than about Clinton's behavior. The strategy was politically effective, but morally corrosive. It sent a message that women who accused powerful men of sexual misconduct would be subjected to intense scrutiny and public humiliation. It established a template for defending against such accusations that prioritized political survival over truth or justice. Clinton won the 1992 election with 43% of the popular vote, helped by the presence of Ross Perot as a third-party candidate who split the Republican vote. At 46 years old, Bill Clinton became the third youngest president in American history, finally achieving the goal he had set for himself as a 16-year-old boy meeting John F. Kennedy. But he entered the White House carrying baggage that would eventually pull him down. His pattern of extramarital affairs was well established. His willingness to lie about his personal behavior was proven. His team's ruthless approach to scandal management was already in place. All the elements were present for the perfect storm that would eventually engulf his presidency. All that was missing was the right woman at the wrong time. Her name was Monica Lewinsky, and in July 1995, she began working as an unpaid White House intern in the office of Chief of Staff Leon Panetta. She was 22 years old, ambitious, and immediately smitten with the president she glimpsed in White House hallways. Monica was the daughter of a well-to-do Beverly Hills family, a psychology graduate from Lewis and Clark College, who had come to Washington with dreams of working in politics. She was intelligent, articulate, and physically attractive in the way that had always caught Bill Clinton's attention. The president first noticed her during the government shutdown in November 1995, when most White House staff had been furloughed but interns were still allowed to work. With fewer people around, Clinton had more opportunities for casual interactions with the skeleton crew keeping the government running. On November 15, 1995, Monica Lewinsky was working late in the West Wing when President Clinton emerged from the Oval Office and began chatting with her and other staff members. It was a seemingly innocent encounter, the kind of informal moment that makes interns feel special and connected to the center of power. But for Monica, it was the beginning of an obsession, and for Clinton, it was the beginning of the end. Over the following weeks, Monica found excuses to linger near the Oval Office, hoping to catch glimpses of the president or brief conversations with him. Clinton, for his part, seemed to enjoy the attention of an attractive young woman who looked at him with obvious admiration. The relationship became physical during the government shutdown, when the nearly empty White House provided opportunities for private encounters. According to Monica's later testimony, their first sexual encounter occurred on November 15, 1995, in a study next to the Oval Office. It was not, technically, sexual intercourse. Clinton would later famously pass the definition of sexual relations to argue that what occurred between them didn't qualify, but it was intimate, inappropriate, and potentially criminal, given the vast power imbalance between the President of the United States and a 22-year-old intern. Over the next 18 months, Clinton and Lewinsky engaged in what she described as a sexual relationship, and what he would later characterize as inappropriate intimate contact. They met privately at least 9 times, usually in the Oval Office study, or in a hallway near the president's private dining room. The encounters followed a predictable pattern. Monica would find a reason to be in the West Wing, often carrying papers that needed the president's attention. Clinton would invite her into his private study, where they would talk, flirt, and engage in sexual activity that stopped short of intercourse. Afterward, Clinton would often become distant and businesslike, as if nothing had happened. For Monica, these encounters were the most exciting and meaningful experiences of her young life. She was having an affair with the President of the United States, the most powerful man in the world. She felt special, chosen, part of history in the making. For Clinton, they appear to have been stress relief, brief escapes from the enormous pressures of the presidency. He was dealing with multiple crises during this period: the Republican takeover of Congress, the government shutdown, foreign policy challenges in Bosnia and Haiti, and ongoing investigations into his Arkansas business dealings. The relationship with Monica provided a few minutes of intimacy and validation in a life that was otherwise consumed by public obligations and political calculations. It was selfish, reckless, and stupid, but it was also predictable given Clinton's established pattern of using sexual relationships to manage stress and feed his ego. But the affair was also different from Clinton's previous extramarital relationships in crucial ways. Monica was much younger than his typical partners, making the power imbalance more extreme. She was a White House employee, creating potential legal liabilities under sexual harassment law, and she was smitten with him in a way that made her both more loyal and more potentially dangerous than women who understood the transactional nature of their relationships with him. Monica kept detailed records of their encounters. She saved gifts Clinton gave her, including a dress and a cigar. She confided in friends about the relationship, describing intimate details of their meetings. Most dangerously, she kept the navy blue Gap dress she had worn during one of their encounters, a dress that was stained with Clinton's DNA. She didn't keep it as evidence, or with any intention of using it against Clinton. She kept it as a souvenir, a tangible reminder of the most important relationship of her life. But that dress would eventually become the smoking gun that would nearly destroy a presidency. In April 1996, Monica was transferred out of the White House to a job at the Pentagon, officially because White House staff felt she was spending too much time trying to see the president. The transfer was devastating for Monica, who interpreted it as punishment for their relationship. She began calling Clinton's secretary Betty Curry, asking to arrange meetings with the president. She sent him gifts and letters. She made it clear that she expected their relationship to continue despite her new position. Clinton, meanwhile, was trying to distance himself from Monica while also managing her expectations. He would occasionally take her phone calls, accept her gifts, and even arrange a few private meetings. But he was also becoming increasingly nervous about the relationship and its potential consequences. In December 1996, Monica received a subpoena to testify in the Paula Jones sexual harassment lawsuit against Clinton. Paula Jones was a former Arkansas state employee who claimed that Clinton had sexually harassed her in 1991 when he was governor. Her lawsuit was one of several legal challenges Clinton was facing related to his past behavior with women. The Jones case was being funded by conservative activists who were determined to find evidence of Clinton's sexual misconduct. Monica's name had surfaced during their investigation, and they suspected she might have information relevant to the case. For Clinton, Monica's involvement in the Jones case transformed their affair from a personal indiscretion into a potential legal catastrophe. If Monica testified truthfully about their relationship, it could provide evidence for Jones's claims about Clinton's pattern of sexual harassment. It could also expose Clinton to charges of perjury if he had denied the relationship under oath. Clinton's response was characteristically calculating. He enlisted his secretary Betty Curry to help manage Monica's testimony. He also began working with his friend Vernon Jordan, a prominent Washington lawyer, to find Monica a job in New York that might make her less willing to cooperate with the Jones investigation. Most crucially, Clinton personally coached Monica on how to testify. In their final private meeting on December 28, 1996, Clinton allegedly told Monica that she could sign an affidavit denying their relationship rather than testifying in person. He also suggested that she could claim their private meetings were simply occasions when she delivered papers to him. It was a conversation that would later be characterized as witness tampering and obstruction of justice. Clinton was using his relationship with Monica to influence her testimony in a legal proceeding where he was the defendant. Monica, still infatuated with Clinton and believing that their relationship might eventually resume, agreed to his suggestions. On January 7, 1997, she signed an affidavit stating, "I have never had a sexual relationship with the president. He did not propose that we have a sexual relationship. He did not offer me employment or other benefits in exchange for a sexual relationship. He did not deny me employment or other benefits for rejecting a sexual relationship." Every major element of that statement was false, but Monica signed it anyway, believing she was protecting both Clinton and herself. But Monica had confided details of her relationship with Clinton to several friends, and one of those friends was secretly recording their conversations. Linda Tripp was a Pentagon employee who had worked in the Bush White House and who harbored deep resentment toward the Clintons. She had befriended Monica and encouraged her to discuss her relationship with the president in explicit detail. Unbeknownst to Monica, Tripp was recording their conversations and sharing the information with literary agent Lucianne Goldberg, who was helping Tripp write a book about Clinton administration scandals. Goldberg, in turn, was connected to conservative activists who were funding the Paula Jones lawsuit. By late 1997, Tripp had accumulated hours of recorded conversations in which Monica described her sexual encounters with Clinton, his gifts to her, and his suggestions about how she should testify in the Paula Jones case. Tripp had also encouraged Monica to save physical evidence of the relationship, including the blue dress that would eventually become the most famous piece of evidence in presidential history. On January 12, 1998, Linda Tripp contacted Kenneth Starr, the independent counsel who was investigating Clinton's Arkansas business dealings in what was known as the Whitewater case. Tripp offered to provide evidence that Clinton had committed perjury and obstruction of justice in connection with the Paula Jones lawsuit. Starr, who had been struggling to find concrete evidence of wrongdoing in the complex Whitewater investigation, immediately recognized the potential significance of Tripp's allegations. Sexual misconduct was easier for the public to understand than complicated real estate transactions, and perjury in a civil case was a clear criminal offense. On January 13, 1998, Tripp met with Monica Lewinsky for lunch at the Pentagon City Ritz-Carlton, wearing a wire provided by FBI agents working for Starr's office. During their conversation, Monica repeated many of the same details about her relationship with Clinton that she had shared in previous conversations, not knowing that this time federal investigators were listening. The next morning, January 14, 1998, Monica was approached by FBI agents and prosecutors from Starr's office, who offered her a choice: cooperate with their investigation or face federal charges for perjury, obstruction of justice, and witness tampering. They showed her photographs of herself entering and leaving the White House, phone records documenting her calls to Clinton, and transcripts of her conversations with Linda Tripp. Monica was terrified. She was 24 years old, alone in a hotel room with federal agents who were threatening her with decades in prison. She asked to call her lawyer, but the prosecutors told her that if she left the room to make the call, their immunity offer would expire. It was psychological pressure designed to force an immediate decision. Monica refused to cooperate without speaking to an attorney, and the agents let her leave. But the trap had been set, and now it was only a matter of time before it closed around the president. On January 17, 1998, Bill Clinton was deposed in the Paula Jones case. His attorneys had prepared him extensively for the questioning, but they didn't know about Linda Tripp's recordings or the FBI's investigation. They thought Monica Lewinsky was just another woman who might have had some minor interaction with the president. Under oath, Clinton was asked directly about his relationship with Monica Lewinsky. "Did you have an extramarital sexual affair with Monica Lewinsky?" asked Jones's attorney. "No," Clinton replied. "If she told someone that she had a sexual affair with you beginning in November of 1995, would that be a lie?" "It's certainly not the truth," Clinton answered. "It was perjury, clear and simple." Clinton was lying under oath about a relationship that federal investigators already had extensive evidence of through Linda Tripp's recordings and Monica's previous statements. But Clinton and his legal team still didn't know how much evidence existed against him. They thought Monica's affidavit denying their relationship would be sufficient protection, and that any accusations would come down to his word against hers. They were catastrophically wrong. 4 days later, on January 24, 1998, The Washington Post published a story by Susan Schmidt, Peter Baker, and Tony Losey, with the headline, "Clinton Accused of Urging Aide to Lie." The story revealed that Kenneth Starr was investigating whether Clinton had encouraged Monica Lewinsky to lie under oath about their relationship. That morning phone call to Clinton from Erskine Bowles wasn't just about a newspaper story. It was about the beginning of the end of his presidency. Within hours, the story exploded across every major news outlet in the country. Cable news channels, which were still relatively new in 1998, began wall-to-wall coverage of what was immediately dubbed the Monica Lewinsky scandal. The phrase "that woman" became a cultural touchstone before Clinton had even uttered it. Clinton's initial response was to deny everything, just as he had done with Jennifer Flowers and every other woman who had accused him of sexual misconduct. On January 26, 1998, he appeared at a White House event and delivered what would become one of the most infamous presidential statements in American history. "I want to say one thing to the American people," Clinton said, pointing his finger directly at the camera. "I want you to listen to me. I'm going to say this again. I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. I never told anybody to lie, not a single time, never. These allegations are false, and I need to go back to work for the American people." It was a masterful performance, delivered with the kind of righteous indignation that had served Clinton well throughout his political career. He appeared genuinely offended by the accusations, hurt that anyone would question his integrity, determined to focus on the people's business rather than tabloid sensationalism. There was only one problem. Every word of it was a lie. Clinton did have sexual relations with Monica Lewinsky, regardless of how he might pass the definition of those words. He did encourage her to be evasive in her testimony, if not to lie outright. And the allegations, while politically motivated, were substantially true. But Clinton's denials were so forceful, so seemingly heartfelt, that many Americans believed him. His approval ratings actually increased in the weeks following his finger-wagging denial. as voters rallied around a president they saw as being unfairly persecuted by partisan prosecutors and a scandal-hungry media. Hillary Clinton also played a crucial role in the early defense strategy. On January 27, 1998, she appeared on The Today Show and delivered her own memorable performance, dismissing the allegations as part of a vast right-wing conspiracy that had been targeting her husband since he entered politics. "This is the great story here for anybody willing to find it and write about it and explain it," Hillary said, "is this vast right-wing conspiracy that has been conspiring against my husband since the day he announced for president." It was a brilliant deflection, shifting the focus from Clinton's behavior to his political enemy's motivations. Rather than defending Clinton's character, Hillary was attacking his accuser's credibility. Rather than addressing the specific allegations, she was contextualizing them as part of a broader political attack. The strategy worked, at least initially. Many Democrats and Clinton supporters rallied around the vast right-wing conspiracy narrative, arguing that the president was being targeted by partisan prosecutors who were more interested in destroying him politically than in uncovering the truth. But while Clinton and his allies were winning the public relations battle, they were losing the legal war. Kenneth Starr's investigation was expanding rapidly, and federal agents were gathering evidence that would make Clinton's denials impossible to maintain. Monica Lewinsky, meanwhile, was caught in an impossible position. She had already committed perjury in her affidavit denying the relationship with Clinton. If she now admitted to the affair, she would be confessing to a federal crime. If she continued to deny it, she would be compounding her legal jeopardy while federal prosecutors had extensive evidence proving she was lying. Monica's mother, Marcia Lewis, hired prominent Washington attorney William Ginsburg to represent her daughter. Ginsburg's strategy was to negotiate an immunity deal that would protect Monica from prosecution in exchange for her truthful testimony about her relationship with Clinton. But the negotiations dragged on for months, as Starr's office demanded complete cooperation from Monica, while her attorneys insisted on ironclad immunity protections. During this period, Monica remained silent, neither confirming nor denying the relationship, while Clinton continued to publicly maintain his innocence. The standoff created a surreal situation in which the President of the United States was publicly denying a relationship that federal investigators had extensive evidence of, while the woman involved remained unable to speak because of ongoing legal negotiations. Meanwhile, Clinton's presidency continued to function, albeit under the shadow of scandal. He traveled overseas, met with foreign leaders, proposed legislation, and tried to maintain the appearance of business as usual. But privately, the scandal was consuming enormous amounts of time and energy that should have been devoted to governing. Clinton's legal team, led by David Kendall and Charles Ruff, was working around the clock to manage multiple investigations and legal challenges. The Paula Jones case was still pending. Kenneth Starr's investigation was expanding beyond Monica Lewinsky to examine other aspects of Clinton's conduct. Congressional Republicans were beginning to discuss the possibility of impeachment proceedings. Hillary Clinton, meanwhile, was dealing with the personal humiliation of having her husband's infidelity exposed on the world stage. She had known about Bill's previous affairs, but this one was different. Monica was younger than most of his previous partners. The relationship had occurred in the White House itself, and the explicit details were being reported in newspapers and discussed on television talk shows. But Hillary's response was characteristically strategic. Rather than wallowing in personal pain, she focused on political damage control. She met with Democratic Party leaders, feminist organizations, and other key constituencies to shore up support for her husband. She appeared at public events with him, providing visual evidence that their marriage was surviving the scandal. Most importantly, she coordinated with Clinton's legal and political teams to develop a unified strategy for managing the crisis. Hillary understood that Bill's survival depended not just on his legal defense but on maintaining enough political support to make impeachment politically costly for Republicans. The Clinton administration's approach to the scandal was multifaceted and sophisticated. Publicly, they maintained Clinton's innocence while attacking the motivations and methods of his accusers. Privately, they were preparing for the possibility that evidence might eventually force Clinton to acknowledge some version of the relationship with Monica. James Carville, Clinton's longtime political advisor, led the public attack on Clinton's enemies. "This is what you get when you drag a $100 bill through a trailer park," Carville said about Paula Jones. establishing the tone of personal destruction that would characterize the Clinton team's defense strategy. Other Clinton allies attacked Linda Tripp as a disgruntled government employee with a history of disloyalty to her bosses. They questioned Kenneth Starr's motivations and methods, arguing that he was exceeding his mandate by investigating Clinton's personal life, rather than focusing on the original Whitewater allegations. The strategy was to make the story about Clinton's enemies, rather than about Clinton's behavior. If voters could be convinced that the president was the victim of a partisan witch hunt, they might forgive his personal failings in order to protect him from political persecution. But while the political strategy was sophisticated, the legal reality was becoming increasingly perilous for Clinton. In April 1998, federal judge Susan Weber Wright dismissed the Paula Jones lawsuit, ruling that even if Jones's allegations were true, they didn't meet the legal standard for sexual harassment. It should have been a victory for Clinton, removing one of the major legal threats he was facing. But the dismissal came too late to help him with the larger scandal. Kenneth Starr's investigation was now focused on Clinton's testimony in the Jones case, and dismissing the underlying lawsuit didn't eliminate the potential perjury charges related to that testimony. More importantly, Starr's investigators were getting closer to securing Monica Lewinsky's cooperation. In July 1998, Monica fired William Ginsburg and hired new attorneys Jacob Stein and Plato Casheris, who were more experienced in negotiating with federal prosecutors. On July 28, 1998, Monica finally reached an immunity agreement with Kenneth Starr's office. In exchange for complete truthful testimony about her relationship with Clinton, she would receive immunity from prosecution for perjury, obstruction of justice, and witness tampering. The immunity agreement was a disaster for Clinton. Monica could now tell her story without fear of legal consequences, and federal prosecutors had extensive evidence to corroborate her testimony. The blue dress, which had been tested for DNA evidence, provided physical proof of intimate contact between Monica and the president. Clinton's attorneys were informed of the immunity agreement and understood immediately what it meant. Their client had been caught in a lie that would be impossible to maintain once Monica testified. The president would have to choose between continuing to deny the relationship, which would constitute additional perjury, or acknowledging it and admitting that he had lied to the American people. On August 6, 1998, Monica Lewinsky appeared before Kenneth Starr's grand jury and provided detailed testimony about her relationship with Clinton. She described their sexual encounters, the gifts they had exchanged, and their conversations about her potential testimony in the Paula Jones case. Most damagingly, Monica testified that Clinton had told her that if asked about their relationship, she could say that she had come to the Oval Office to deliver papers, which was technically true but misleading about the nature of their encounters. This testimony provided evidence that Clinton had encouraged Monica to be deceptive in her potential testimony, which could constitute obstruction of justice. On August 17, 1998, Clinton became the first sitting president in American history to testify before a federal grand jury as the target of a criminal investigation. The testimony was conducted via closed-circuit television from the White House, with Clinton answering questions from prosecutors in Starr's office. Clinton's grand jury testimony was a masterclass in verbal gymnastics and legal evasion. He acknowledged that he had engaged in improper intimate physical contact with Monica Lewinsky, but he insisted that their encounters didn't constitute sexual relations, as he understood the term to be defined in the Paula Jones case. It depends on what the meaning of the word is. Clinton famously said when questioned about his attorney's statement that there is absolutely no sex of any kind in his relationship with Monica. The phrase became a symbol of Clinton's tendency to parse language in ways that were technically accurate but substantively misleading. Clinton also testified that he didn't believe he had encouraged Monica to lie, but rather had suggested that she could give truthful but incomplete answers about their relationship. It was a distinction that satisfied neither legal nor common-sense standards of honesty. The grand jury testimony was sealed, but Clinton's legal team knew that Kenneth Starr would eventually release a report to Congress detailing his findings. That report would include Clinton's testimony and would likely recommend impeachment proceedings based on charges of perjury and obstruction of justice. Clinton faced a choice that would define the remainder of his presidency. He could continue to maintain his innocence and fight the charges, or he could acknowledge his mistakes and try to manage the political fallout. On the evening of August 17, 1998, immediately after his grand jury testimony, Clinton addressed the nation from the Oval Office. It was one of the most difficult speeches any president has ever had to deliver, an attempt to acknowledge wrongdoing while minimizing legal and political consequences. As you know, in a deposition in January, I was asked questions about my relationship with Monica Lewinsky. Clinton began. While my answers were legally accurate, I did not volunteer information. Indeed, I did have a relationship with Miss Lewinsky that was not appropriate. In fact, it was wrong. It was an admission that destroyed Clinton's previous denials while still attempting to maintain that he hadn't committed perjury. Clinton was acknowledging the relationship while insisting that his previous testimony had been legally accurate, a distinction that fooled no one but might provide some legal protection. Clinton also used the speech to attack Kenneth Starr's investigation, arguing that the prosecutor had exceeded his authority and invaded Clinton's privacy. The independent counsel investigation moved on to my staff and friends, then into my private life, he said. And now the investigation itself is under investigation. The speech was a political disaster. Clinton appeared angry and unrepentant, more concerned with attacking his enemies than with taking responsibility for his actions. He offered no apology to Monica Lewinsky, who had been subjected to intense public scrutiny and personal attacks from Clinton's defenders. He showed no recognition of how his behavior had damaged the presidency or the country. Most Americans had expected Clinton to be contrite and humble, to acknowledge the pain he had caused and ask for forgiveness. Instead, he seemed to be arguing that his private life was none of the public's business, even when it involved lying under oath in a federal court proceeding. The speech marked a turning point in public opinion about the scandal. Clinton's approval ratings, which had remained relatively high throughout the scandal, began to decline as Americans realized that their president had indeed lied to them for 7 months about his relationship with Monica Lewinsky. Hillary Clinton's reaction to her husband's admission was swift and devastating. She had publicly defended him, attacked his accusers, and put her own credibility on the line by dismissing the allegations as politically motivated lies. Now she discovered that she had been deceived along with everyone else. According to later accounts by Clinton administration officials, Hillary was furious with her husband, not just because of the affair itself, but because of how his lies had made her complicit in deceiving the American people. She had appeared on national television and defended him based on information she now knew to be false. Hillary's anger was both personal and political. As a woman, she was humiliated by her husband's infidelity and his public denials of it. As a political partner, she was furious that his reckless behavior had jeopardized everything they had worked to achieve together. For several weeks after Clinton's admission, Hillary barely spoke to her husband. She cancelled a planned vacation with him, refused to appear at public events by his side, and made it clear through her staff that she was reconsidering their entire relationship. The marriage crisis added another layer of complexity to Clinton's political problems. If Hillary had left him or filed for divorce, it would have made his political position untenable. No president had ever survived a divorce while in office, and Clinton's support among women voters, which was crucial to his political coalition, would have collapsed entirely. But Hillary ultimately decided to stay, not necessarily because she had forgiven Bill, but because she believed that leaving would give his enemies the victory they were seeking. She was not going to let Ken Starr and the Republican Party destroy her husband, even if he had betrayed her personally. On September 9, 1998, Kenneth Starr delivered his report to Congress. The Starr Report, as it became known, was a 445-page document detailing Clinton's relationship with Monica Lewinsky and recommending that Congress consider 11 possible grounds for impeachment. The report was extraordinarily explicit, describing sexual encounters between Clinton and Monica in graphic detail that was unprecedented in an official government document. Starr justified the explicit language by arguing that the specific details were necessary to establish the legal elements of perjury and obstruction of justice. But critics argued that Starr had included salacious details that were irrelevant to the legal charges, essentially producing government-sanctioned pornography designed to humiliate and damage Clinton politically. The Starr Report was released to the public on the internet, making it the first major government document to be distributed primarily through digital means. Millions of Americans read the explicit details of their president's sexual encounters, transforming a legal proceeding into a form of public entertainment. The report's release marked another escalation in the scandal. Clinton was no longer just dealing with allegations or even his own admissions. Now there was an official government document, produced by a federal prosecutor, that described his behavior in the most damaging possible terms and recommended that Congress remove him from office. House Republicans, who had gained control of Congress in the 1994 midterm elections, began formal impeachment proceedings in October 1998. The House Judiciary Committee, chaired by Henry Hyde of Illinois, held hearings to determine whether Clinton's conduct met the constitutional standard for high crimes and misdemeanors. The impeachment hearings were conducted along strictly partisan lines. Republicans argued that Clinton had committed perjury and obstruction of justice, federal crimes that warranted removal from office regardless of their underlying subject matter. They insisted that the issue wasn't Clinton's affair with Monica Lewinsky, but his willingness to lie under oath and obstruct justice to cover it up. Democrats argued that Clinton's behavior, while wrong and inappropriate, didn't rise to the level of impeachable offenses. They contended that impeachment was intended for cases of treason, bribery, or other serious abuses of presidential power, not for personal misconduct and attempts to conceal it. The hearings featured testimony from Kenneth Starr, who defended his investigation and his recommendation for impeachment. Starr argued that Clinton had committed serious federal crimes and that allowing him to remain in office would send a message that presidents were above the law. Democratic members of the Judiciary Committee attacked Starr's investigation as overly broad and politically motivated. They argued that he had exceeded his original mandate to investigate the Whitewater real estate deal and had become obsessed with Clinton's personal life. The hearings also featured testimony from legal scholars, constitutional experts, and historians who debated whether Clinton's conduct met the constitutional standard for impeachment. The experts were divided largely along partisan lines, with Republican witnesses supporting impeachment and Democratic witnesses opposing it. Throughout the hearings, Clinton continued to govern and campaign for Democratic candidates in the 1998 midterm elections. His strategy was to focus on policy issues that mattered to voters while portraying the impeachment proceedings as a partisan distraction from the nation's business. The strategy appeared to be working. Despite the scandal, Democrats performed better than expected in the 1998 midterm elections, actually gaining seats in the House of Representatives. It was the first time since 1934 that the president's party had gained House seats in a midterm election. The election results were interpreted as a repudiation of the Republican impeachment effort. Voters seemed to be saying that while they disapproved of Clinton's behavior, they didn't want him removed from office, and they blamed Republicans for pursuing impeachment despite public opposition. The electoral setback led to the resignation of House Speaker Newt Gingrich, who had been one of the leading advocates for Clinton's impeachment. Gingrich's departure removed one of Clinton's most prominent critics, and seemed to signal that the Republican impeachment effort was politically damaging to its supporters. But House Republicans, despite their electoral losses, pressed forward with impeachment. On December 19, 1998, the House of Representatives voted largely along party lines to impeach President Clinton on charges of perjury and obstruction of justice. Clinton became only the second president in American history to be impeached by the House of Representatives. The vote was 228-06 on the perjury charge, and 221-221 the obstruction of justice charge, with only a handful of members crossing party lines. The impeachment marked a constitutional crisis, unlike anything the country had experienced since the Civil War. For the first time in 130 years, a president would face trial in the Senate, where a two-thirds majority would be required to remove him from office. Clinton's reaction to the impeachment vote was characteristically defiant. He appeared in the Rose Garden with Hillary and other supporters, delivering a brief statement in which he apologized for his conduct, but vowed to continue serving as president. "I will continue to do the work of the American people," Clinton said. "What the Congress decides to do is up to them, but I'm going to do what I was hired to do." It was a message designed to portray Clinton as focused on governing, while his enemies were obsessed with partisan politics. The strategy was to make impeachment seem like a distraction from more important issues, rather than a legitimate constitutional process. The Senate trial began on January 7, 1999, with Chief Justice William Rehnquist presiding. The House managers, led by Judiciary Committee Chairman Henry Hyde, presented their case for removing Clinton from office, while Clinton's defense team, led by White House counsel Charles Ruff and private attorney David Kendall, argued for his acquittal. The trial was conducted with the formal dignity appropriate to a constitutional proceeding, but it was also shaped by the political realities of the situation. Republicans knew they didn't have the two-thirds majority needed to convict Clinton, and Democrats were united in opposition to removal. The House managers argued that Clinton had committed serious federal crimes, and that allowing him to remain in office would damage the rule of law. They portrayed Clinton as a president who believed he was above the law, and who would stop at nothing to protect himself politically. Clinton's defense team argued that his conduct, while inappropriate, didn't constitute the kind of high crimes and misdemeanors that warranted removal from office. They contended that impeachment was intended for cases where the president had abused his official powers, not for personal misconduct that was unrelated to his presidential duties. The defense also argued that Clinton's lies were about private matters and were motivated by a desire to protect his family from embarrassment, not by any corrupt intent to obstruct justice. They portrayed Clinton as a flawed human being who had made mistakes but who hadn't committed impeachable offenses. The trial featured no live witnesses, unlike the Andrew Johnson impeachment trial in 1868. Instead, senators viewed videotaped depositions from Monica Lewinsky, Vernon Jordan, and Sidney Blumenthal, three key figures in the scandal. Monica's deposition was particularly significant because it was the first time she had spoken publicly about her relationship with Clinton since the scandal began. Her testimony was calm and detailed, providing a first-hand account of her encounters with the president and their discussions about her potential testimony in the Paula Jones case. Monica's testimony largely corroborated the account in the Starr report, but it also humanized her in ways that the clinical language of the prosecutor's report hadn't. She came across as a young woman who had been infatuated with a powerful man and who had been caught up in events far beyond her control or understanding. The deposition also revealed the emotional toll the scandal had taken on Monica. She had been subjected to intense media scrutiny, public humiliation, and legal jeopardy. Her personal and professional life had been destroyed by her relationship with Clinton, and she was clearly still struggling with the aftermath. Vernon Jordan's deposition focused on his efforts to help Monica find a job in New York, which prosecutors alleged was part of an effort to influence her testimony. Jordan denied that his job search assistance was connected to Monica's legal situation, arguing that he was simply helping a young person advance her career. Sidney Blumenthal's deposition dealt with his conversations with Clinton about Monica and his subsequent discussions with reporters. Blumenthal had been one of Clinton's most aggressive defenders, and his testimony provided insight into the White House's strategy for managing the scandal. After 5 weeks of trial proceedings, the Senate voted on February 12, 1999. The perjury charge failed by a vote of 45 to 55, with 10 Republicans joining all 45 Democrats in voting for acquittal. The obstruction of justice charge failed by a vote of 50-50, with 5 Republicans joining the Democrats. Clinton was acquitted on both charges, allowing him to serve out the remainder of his presidency. But the acquittal was hardly a vindication. A majority of senators had voted that Clinton was guilty of obstruction of justice, and even some Democrats who voted for acquittal acknowledged that they believed Clinton had committed the acts he was charged with. The impeachment and trial had lasted more than a year, from the initial revelation of the Lewinsky scandal in January 1998 to the Senate acquittal in February 1999. During that time, Clinton's presidency had been consumed by legal and political battles that prevented him from focusing fully on governing. The scandal had also taken a severe personal toll on Clinton and his family. His marriage had survived, but it had been severely damaged. His relationship with his daughter Chelsea, who was attending Stanford University during the scandal, had been complicated by the public humiliation of having her father's sexual behavior discussed in explicit detail in newspapers and on television. Hillary Clinton had emerged from the scandal as a political figure in her own right, no longer just the president's wife, but a formidable politician who had played a crucial role in her husband's survival. Her loyalty during the crisis had earned her respect from Democrats and had positioned her for her own political career. Monica Lewinsky, meanwhile, had paid the highest personal price for the scandal. She had been transformed from a private citizen into one of the most famous women in the world, but her fame was based entirely on her sexual relationship with the president. Her career prospects had been severely damaged, and she would struggle for years to build a life beyond her role in the Clinton scandal. The country had also paid a price for the scandal. For more than a year, the government had been distracted by impeachment proceedings instead of focusing on domestic and foreign policy challenges. The scandal had contributed to increased cynicism about politics and politicians, and had coarsened public discourse by making explicit sexual details a routine part of political coverage. but Clinton had survived, becoming only the second president to be impeached and the first to be acquitted by the Senate. His approval ratings, which had remained surprisingly high throughout much of the scandal, were still above 60% when he left office in January 2001. The survival was a testament to Clinton's political skills, but it was also a reflection of the American people's ability to separate their personal disapproval of Clinton's behavior from their assessment of his job performance as president. Many Americans believed Clinton had lied and behaved inappropriately, but they also believed the economy was strong and the country was moving in the right direction. Clinton's final 2 years in office were marked by efforts to rebuild his legacy and restore his historical reputation. He focused on foreign policy achievements, including peace efforts in the Middle East and intervention in Kosovo. He also worked to secure his domestic policy legacy, particularly in areas like economic policy and social programs. But the Lewinsky scandal continued to shadow Clinton even after his acquittal. In his final days in office, he reached a settlement with Paula Jones, paying her $85,000 to resolve her sexual harassment lawsuit. He also accepted a fine and temporary suspension of his law license to resolve the perjury charges related to his testimony in the Jones case. On his final day in office, January 19, 2001, Clinton issued a statement acknowledging that he had given false testimony under oath and expressing regret for his actions. It was the closest he ever came to a full apology for his behavior during the scandal. "I tried to walk a fine line between acting lawfully and testifying falsely, but I now recognize that I did not fully accomplish this goal, and that certain of my responses to questions about Ms. Lewinsky were false," Clinton said. Even this statement was carefully worded to minimize Clinton's legal exposure while acknowledging some wrongdoing. It was typical of Clinton's approach throughout the scandal, giving ground only when absolutely necessary and never more than required. The Monica Lewinsky scandal fundamentally changed American politics in ways that are still being felt today. It established new precedents for how personal behavior by public officials would be scrutinized and reported. It demonstrated the power of independent prosecutors to investigate and potentially destroy political careers. It showed how partisan polarization could turn constitutional processes like impeachment into purely political weapons. The scandal also changed the Clinton presidency and Clinton himself. He had entered office as a young, charismatic leader who represented generational change and new possibilities for American politics. He left office as a damaged figure whose personal failings had overshadowed many of his policy achievements. But Clinton's survival also demonstrated the resilience of American democratic institutions and the American people's capacity for forgiveness. Despite his lies and personal failings, Clinton had not been removed from office, and the country had continued to function throughout the crisis. The scandal revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the American political system. It showed that no one, not even the president, was above the law, but it also showed how legal and constitutional processes could be manipulated for political advantage. Most of all, the Monica Lewinsky scandal was a story about human frailty and the consequences of personal weakness in public life. Bill Clinton was a gifted politician who achieved remarkable success, but he was also a flawed human being whose appetites and poor judgment nearly destroyed everything he had worked to achieve. The blue dress that started our story, the navy blue Gap dress that Monica Lewinsky wore to one of her encounters with President Clinton, became a symbol of how personal choices by powerful people can have consequences far beyond what anyone could have imagined. A simple piece of clothing became evidence in a constitutional crisis, proof that even presidents must answer for their actions. And somewhere in the quiet moments after the cameras stopped rolling, after the trials ended, and the senators went home, Bill Clinton was left to contemplate the cost of his appetites. He had survived impeachment, but he had lost something harder to measure: the trust of the American people and the respect of history. The boy from Hope, Arkansas, who had dreamed of greatness since meeting John F. Kennedy, had achieved the presidency, but had also learned that victory without honor is hollow, that survival without redemption is just another form of defeat. In the end, Bill Clinton's presidency became a cautionary tale about the relationship between public power and private character, a reminder that in American democracy, both matter and neither can be ignored for long. The most powerful man in the world had been brought low by a 22-year-old intern and a blue dress, proving that in America, no one, not even the president, can escape the consequences of their choices forever. But the Monica Lewinsky scandal, while the most famous and consequential of Clinton's controversies, was hardly his only brush with scandal during his 8 years in office. Clinton had arrived in Washington carrying enough baggage to fill a freight train, and he managed to accumulate even more during his presidency. Even before Monica Lewinsky ever set foot in the White House, Clinton was already dealing with what would become known as the Whitewater controversy, a complex web of questionable real estate investments and political favoritism that stretched back to his days as Arkansas governor. The scandal was so convoluted that most Americans never fully understood what Clinton allegedly did wrong, which was both a blessing and a curse for his presidency. The story began in 1978, when Bill and Hillary Clinton joined with James and Susan McDougal to purchase 220 acres of undeveloped land along the White River in the Ozark Mountains of Arkansas. The plan was to subdivide the land into vacation home lots and sell them to middle-class families looking for affordable recreation property. It seemed like a straightforward real estate investment, the kind of side business that ambitious young couples often pursue to supplement their incomes. Bill was Arkansas Attorney General, earning a modest government salary, and Hillary was working at the Rose Law Firm in Little Rock. The McDougals were experienced real estate developers who promised to handle the day-to-day management of the project. But like so many Clinton ventures, what appeared simple on the surface was actually riddled with complications, conflicts of interest, and questionable judgment that would later provide ammunition for his political enemies. James McDougal wasn't just a real estate developer, he was also a savings and loan executive, who would eventually use his position at Madison Guaranty Savings and Loan to finance various business ventures, including the Whitewater development. When the savings and loan industry collapsed in the late 1980s, taking Madison Guaranty with it, federal regulators began investigating where the money had gone. What they found was a pattern of self-dealing and questionable loans that benefited McDougal's friends and business partners, including Bill and Hillary Clinton. The Clintons had invested relatively little of their own money in Whitewater, but had benefited from loans and guarantees provided by Madison Guaranty, a federally insured institution that eventually cost taxpayers millions of dollars when it failed. The technical details of the Whitewater transactions were mind-numbingly complex, involving multiple companies, loans, guarantees, and accounting maneuvers that seemed designed to obscure who was responsible for what. But the basic allegation was simple. Bill and Hillary Clinton had used their political connections to benefit financially from a savings and loan that later failed at taxpayer expense. Unlike the Monica Lewinsky scandal, which involved behavior that ordinary Americans could easily understand and judge, Whitewater was the kind of white-collar controversy that required accountants and lawyers to fully comprehend. Most voters found it boring and confusing, which helped Clinton politically but also meant that legitimate questions about his financial dealings never received the scrutiny they deserved. The Whitewater controversy first became public during Clinton's 1992 presidential campaign, when the New York Times published a story questioning the Clintons' relationship with the McDougals and their investments in the failed Arkansas real estate venture. The story should have been a major scandal, but it was overshadowed by the Jennifer Flowers allegations and other personal controversies that were easier for voters to understand. Clinton's response to the Whitewater allegations followed the same pattern he would later use during the Monica Lewinsky scandal: acknowledge no wrongdoing, attack the credibility of the accusers, and provide just enough information to avoid appearing to hide something, while actually revealing as little as possible. The Clintons promised to release their tax returns and other financial documents related to Whitewater, but they delayed the release for months and provided incomplete information when they finally did so. When pressed for more details, they claimed that most of the relevant documents had been lost or destroyed, a pattern of missing paperwork that would become a recurring theme in Clinton-related investigations. Hillary Clinton, in particular, seemed to have remarkably bad luck when it came to preserving documents related to potentially controversial matters. Her Rose Law Firm billing records, which might have shown the extent of her work for Madison Guaranty, disappeared from the White House and weren't found until 1996, when they mysteriously turned up in the residential quarters after a 2-year search. The missing documents were found by Carolyn Huber, a former Rose Law Firm employee who worked as a personal assistant to the Clintons in the White House. Huber claimed she had discovered the documents in a box of personal papers and had initially put them aside without realizing their significance. The documents had apparently been sitting in Huber's office for months before she recognized what they were and turned them over to investigators. The discovery of the billing records was particularly embarrassing because Hillary had previously testified under oath that she couldn't recall many details about her work for Madison Guaranty. The records showed that she had actually done substantial work for the savings and loan, including meetings with state regulators and other activities that could have constituted conflicts of interest given her husband's position as governor. The pattern of missing and mysteriously reappearing documents became a hallmark of Clinton-related investigations throughout the 1990s. Critical papers would disappear at convenient times, only to surface later, after investigations had moved on to other topics. The coincidences were so frequent and so convenient that they strained credibility, but proving intentional obstruction was difficult without direct evidence of deliberate destruction or concealment. In 1994, under pressure from Congress and facing the appointment of a special prosecutor, the Clintons agreed to turn over all their Whitewater-related documents to investigators. But even this supposedly complete document production was problematic, as additional papers continued to surface periodically, suggesting that the initial disclosure had been incomplete. The appointment of Robert Fisk as special prosecutor in January 1994 marked the beginning of what would become a 4-year investigation into various aspects of Clinton's business and political dealings. Fisk was replaced in August 1994 by Kenneth Starr, whose investigation would eventually expand to encompass not just Whitewater, but also the Monica Lewinsky affair and other Clinton controversies. Starr's investigation into Whitewater ultimately resulted in convictions of 15 people, including James and Susan McDougal and Arkansas Governor Jim Guy Tucker, Clinton's successor as governor. The McDougals were convicted of fraud and conspiracy charges related to their operation of Madison Guaranty, while Tucker was convicted of similar charges related to other questionable loans and business deals. But despite years of investigation and millions of dollars in legal fees, prosecutors never found sufficient evidence to charge either Bill or Hillary Clinton with criminal wrongdoing related to Whitewater. The Clintons' defenders argued that this vindicated them, while their critics claimed that the lack of charges reflected the difficulty of prosecuting powerful political figures rather than their innocence. The truth about Whitewater probably lies somewhere in between. The Clintons almost certainly engaged in questionable judgment and conflicts of interest, benefiting financially from their relationship with people who were later convicted of fraud, but whether their actions rose to the level of criminal behavior is less clear, particularly given the complex web of transactions and the passage of time between the original investments and the investigation. What is clear is that Whitewater established a pattern that would characterize Clinton's entire presidency. Legitimate questions about his conduct would be raised, investigations would be launched, documents would go missing, and Clinton would ultimately survive through a combination of legal maneuvering, political skill, and the difficulty of proving criminal intent in complex financial transactions. The Whitewater investigation also introduced the country to Hillary Clinton as a formidable political figure in her own right, not just the president's wife. Her testimony before various congressional committees and grand juries revealed a sharp legal mind and a combative personality that could hold its own against aggressive prosecutors and hostile politicians. But Hillary's prominent role in defending the family's financial dealings also made her a target for Clinton's enemies in a way that previous first ladies had not been. She was accused of being the mastermind behind various schemes to conceal documents and obstruct investigations, charges that she denied but that followed her throughout her own political career. The Whitewater controversy was also notable for the way it demonstrated the power of modern media to sustain complex investigations over long periods of time. The story had enough twists and turns to provide regular fodder for newspaper articles and television reports, even when there were no major new developments. The mere existence of an ongoing investigation became news in itself, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of coverage that kept the controversy alive in the public consciousness. While Whitewater provided the legal framework for investigating Clinton, it was hardly the only source of controversy during his presidency. Clinton had what seemed to be an almost magnetic attraction to scandal, drawing accusations and investigations the way some people attract mosquitoes. There was the Travelgate controversy, which began in May 1993, when the White House abruptly fired 7 employees of the White House Travel Office and replaced them with a travel company that had connections to Clinton's Arkansas associates. The firings were initially justified by allegations of financial mismanagement in the travel office, but it later emerged that the accusations were largely unfounded, and that the real motivation was apparently to give the business to Clinton's friends. The controversy was made worse by Hillary Clinton's role in the firings. White House documents and testimony suggested that she had been instrumental in the decision to remove the travel office employees, despite initial White House denials of her involvement. The revelation that the First Lady had been involved in what appeared to be a purely political personnel decision raised questions about her proper role in the administration. The travel office employees were eventually vindicated when the FBI investigation found no evidence of criminal wrongdoing, and the head of the office, Billy Dale, was acquitted on all charges after a trial. But by then, the damage to the Clinton administration's credibility had been done, and Travelgate had entered the lexicon of Clinton scandals. The Travelgate affair was relatively minor in terms of its direct consequences, but it was significant because it established early in Clinton's presidency a pattern of behavior that would be repeated in more serious controversies: make accusations against perceived enemies, use government resources to investigate them, and then claim vindication when the accusations proved unfounded, even though the process itself had served its purpose of removing obstacles or distracting from other problems. Then there was the controversy over Clinton's use of the Lincoln bedroom for fundraising purposes. Throughout his presidency, Clinton invited major Democratic donors to spend the night in the historic bedroom, creating the appearance that access to the president and the symbolic heart of American democracy could be purchased with campaign contributions. The practice wasn't technically illegal, since the Lincoln bedroom visits were characterized as social events rather than official fundraising activities. But the optics were terrible, suggesting that Clinton was treating the White House like a hotel for wealthy supporters rather than maintaining the dignity and independence that Americans expected from their president. The Lincoln bedroom controversy was part of a broader pattern of questionable fundraising practices that characterized Clinton's 1996 re-election campaign. The campaign accepted money from foreign nationals, held fundraising events on federal property, and engaged in other activities that pushed the boundaries of campaign finance law. The most serious allegations involved Chinese nationals who had contributed money to Clinton's campaign, possibly in violation of federal laws prohibiting foreign contributions to American political campaigns. Some of the contributors had connections to the Chinese government, raising the possibility that foreign powers were attempting to influence American elections through illegal campaign contributions. The Chinese fundraising controversy never resulted in criminal charges against Clinton himself, but it did lead to convictions of several other individuals involved in the fundraising schemes. More importantly, it reinforced public perceptions of Clinton as someone who was willing to bend or break rules when it served his political interests. Clinton's problems with women extended far beyond Monica Lewinsky and Jennifer Flowers. Throughout his presidency, he faced a series of allegations from women who claimed he had sexually harassed or assaulted them, creating a pattern that suggested systematic misconduct rather than isolated incidents. Paula Jones, the Arkansas state employee whose sexual harassment lawsuit had provided the legal context for Clinton's perjury about Monica Lewinsky, was just one of several women who accused Clinton of inappropriate sexual behavior. Her allegations, if true, suggested that Clinton had used his position as governor to pressure female employees into sexual encounters. Kathleen Willey, a White House volunteer, accused Clinton of groping her in the Oval Office in 1993 when she came to see him about a personal financial crisis. Willey's allegations were particularly damaging because she was a Democratic supporter who had no apparent political motivation for making false accusations against Clinton. Juanita Broderick, an Arkansas nursing home administrator, accused Clinton of raping her in a Little Rock hotel room in 1978 when he was Arkansas Attorney General and running for governor. Broderick's allegations were the most serious of all the accusations against Clinton, but they surfaced publicly only after Clinton had left office, limiting their political impact. The women's allegations created a pattern that was difficult for Clinton's defenders to dismiss as politically motivated attacks. While individual accusations might be questioned, the number and consistency of the allegations suggested that Clinton had engaged in a pattern of sexual misconduct that spanned decades and continued even after he became president. Clinton's defenders argued that all of the allegations were part of a coordinated political attack designed to destroy his presidency, but this explanation became less credible as more women came forward with similar stories. The sheer number of accusers and the fact that many of them were Democrats or Clinton supporters made it difficult to maintain that all of the allegations were fabricated for political purposes. The pattern of allegations also revealed Clinton's fundamental attitude toward women and power. Despite his public support for women's rights and his appointment of women to high-level government positions, Clinton's private behavior suggested that he viewed women primarily as objects for his own gratification, rather than as equals deserving of respect. This contradiction between Clinton's public persona and private behavior was one of the most troubling aspects of his presidency. He could deliver eloquent speeches about equality and justice while privately treating women in ways that violated the very principles he claimed to champion. The allegations against Clinton also highlighted the broader issue of how powerful men use their positions to exploit women who are dependent on them for employment or other benefits. Clinton's accusers typically were in positions where they needed his favor or approval, making them vulnerable to pressure and retaliation if they resisted his advances or complained about his behavior. The Clinton administration's response to these allegations followed a consistent pattern: attack the credibility of the accusers, investigate their personal lives, and suggest that they were motivated by money or political gain rather than truth. This strategy was often effective in the short term, discrediting individual accusers and preventing their allegations from gaining traction in the media. But the strategy also had long-term costs, both for Clinton personally and for the broader culture around sexual harassment and assault. By aggressively attacking women who accused him of misconduct, Clinton and his allies sent a message that such accusers would face intense scrutiny and personal attacks, potentially discouraging other victims from coming forward. The Clinton years also saw a number of suspicious deaths and suicides among people connected to the president, leading to conspiracy theories about Clinton's alleged willingness to eliminate potential threats to his political career. While these theories were largely unfounded, they reflected the broader atmosphere of suspicion and distrust that surrounded Clinton throughout his presidency. The most prominent of these deaths was that of Vincent Foster, the deputy White House counsel, who had been Hillary Clinton's law partner at the Rose law firm in Arkansas. Foster was found dead in a Virginia park in July 1993, with a gunshot wound to the head and what appeared to be a suicide note in his briefcase. Foster had been responsible for handling various legal matters for the Clintons, including some aspects of the Whitewater investigation. He had also been deeply involved in the travel office firings and other early controversies of the Clinton administration. His death came at a time when he was under intense pressure from media coverage and congressional investigations. The official investigation concluded that Foster had committed suicide, apparently because he was depressed about the pressures of Washington political life and the intense media scrutiny he was facing. But conspiracy theorists suggested that Foster had been murdered because he knew too much about Clinton's questionable dealings and was about to expose them. The Foster conspiracy theories were fueled by the Clinton administration's handling of his office after his death. White House officials, including Hillary Clinton's chief of staff, entered Foster's office and removed documents before investigators could secure the scene. This created the appearance of a cover-up, even if the document removal was motivated by legitimate concerns about attorney-client privilege, rather than by a desire to conceal evidence of wrongdoing. Other deaths connected to Clinton included those of Commerce Secretary Ron Brown, who died in a plane crash in Croatia while leading a trade mission, and several Arkansas associates who died in various accidents or under suspicious circumstances. While none of these deaths was ever linked to Clinton through credible evidence, they contributed to an atmosphere of suspicion and conspiracy theories that followed him throughout his presidency. The conspiracy theories about Clinton were largely unfounded, but they reflected a deeper truth about his presidency. Clinton's pattern of questionable behavior and less than honest explanations had created an environment in which even far-fetched allegations seemed plausible to his critics. Clinton's problems weren't limited to personal scandals and questionable financial dealings. His presidency was also marked by a series of foreign policy controversies that raised questions about his judgment and competence as commander-in-chief. The most serious of these was the terrorist attack on the federal building in Oklahoma City in April 1995, which killed 168 people and was initially blamed on foreign terrorists before it was discovered that the perpetrator was actually Timothy McVeigh, a domestic terrorist motivated by anti-government ideology. While Clinton wasn't responsible for the attack, his administration's initial response revealed serious problems with intelligence gathering and analysis. The assumption that the bombing was the work of foreign terrorists rather than domestic extremists suggested that federal agencies weren't adequately monitoring the growing militia movement and other domestic terrorist threats. Clinton's foreign policy was also marked by a series of military interventions that seemed to follow no clear strategic doctrine. He ordered missile strikes against Iraq, Sudan, and Afghanistan at various times during his presidency, often with limited consultation with Congress or clear explanations of the objectives. The timing of some of these military actions raised questions about whether Clinton was using foreign policy to distract from domestic scandals. The missile strikes against Sudan and Afghanistan in August 1998 came just 3 days after Clinton's grand jury testimony in the Monica Lewinsky case, leading critics to suggest that the attacks were designed to change the subject from his personal problems. The strikes targeted what the administration claimed were terrorist training camps and a chemical weapons factory, but subsequent investigations suggested that the intelligence justifying the attacks was questionable. The supposed chemical weapons factory in Sudan turned out to be a pharmaceutical plant that produced medicine for the local population, not chemical weapons for terrorists. Clinton's intervention in Somalia, which he inherited from George H.W. Bush but escalated during his presidency, ended in disaster when American soldiers were killed and dragged through the streets of Mogadishu in October 1993. The incident, immortalized in the book and movie Black Hawk Down, became a symbol of the dangers of military intervention without clear objectives or adequate preparation. The Somalia debacle made Clinton extremely reluctant to commit American forces to other humanitarian crises, most notably the genocide in Rwanda in 1994. Despite clear evidence that hundreds of thousands of people were being massacred, Clinton refused to intervene militarily or even to call the killings genocide, because doing so would have triggered legal obligations to act under international law. Clinton's failure to respond to the Rwandan genocide was one of the most morally indefensible decisions of his presidency, allowing one of the worst humanitarian disasters of the 20th century to unfold, while the world's most powerful nation stood by and watched. Clinton later acknowledged that his failure to act in Rwanda was one of his greatest regrets as president. The pattern of Clinton's foreign policy decisions suggested a president who was more concerned with political calculations than with strategic objectives or moral imperatives. Military interventions were often timed to coincide with domestic political needs, while humanitarian crises were ignored if responding to them might be politically costly. Clinton's approach to terrorism in particular reflected the limitations of treating national security as a subset of domestic politics. Throughout the 1990s, Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations were growing in strength and planning attacks against American targets, but Clinton's response was often limited to missile strikes and law enforcement measures that failed to address the underlying threat. The 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center, the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing, the 1996 bombing of the Khobar Towers military housing complex in Saudi Arabia, the 1998 bombings of American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, and the 2000 bombing of the USS Cole in Yemen, all occurred during Clinton's presidency, suggesting a pattern of escalating terrorist threats that his administration failed to adequately address. Clinton's defenders argue that he did take terrorism seriously, and that many of the policies and organizations created during his presidency laid the groundwork for the more aggressive counter-terrorism efforts that followed 9/11. But critics contend that Clinton's focus on domestic scandals and political survival prevented him from giving adequate attention to the growing terrorist threat. The Clinton presidency was also marked by missed opportunities to address long-term challenges facing the country. Despite presiding over the longest economic expansion in American history, Clinton did little to address the growing federal deficit, the looming crisis in Social Security and Medicare, or the increasing polarization of American politics. Clinton's approach to governing was largely reactive rather than visionary. He was extraordinarily skilled at responding to immediate political challenges and managing crises, but he was less effective at developing and implementing long-term solutions to complex problems. The balanced budgets of Clinton's later years were achieved largely through economic growth and restraints on spending growth, rather than through fundamental reforms to government programs or tax policy. When the economic expansion ended and the budget surpluses disappeared during George W. Bush's presidency, it became clear that Clinton's fiscal achievements were more fragile than they had appeared. Similarly, Clinton's success in managing the various scandals of his presidency masked deeper problems with his approach to leadership and governance. His ability to survive political attacks and maintain public support demonstrated his extraordinary political skills. but it also revealed a willingness to subordinate truth and accountability to political expedience. The pattern of Clinton's responses to scandal: deny, attack accusers, pass language, claim vindication when charges weren't filed, became a template for political scandal management that influenced how subsequent politicians dealt with similar situations. The Clinton model prioritized political survival over transparency or accountability, with long-term consequences for American political culture. Clinton's legacy as president is thus deeply complicated. He presided over an era of peace and prosperity, appointed competent people to important positions, and advanced progressive causes on issues like healthcare, education, and civil rights. His political skills and policy knowledge were undeniable, and many of his specific achievements were genuinely beneficial to the country. But Clinton's presidency was also marked by constant controversy, questionable judgment, and a pattern of behavior that undermined trust in government and political institutions. His scandals dominated headlines and congressional attention, distracting from policy debates and governance. His personal conduct sent troubling messages about power and accountability, particularly regarding the treatment of women. Most significantly, Clinton's presidency demonstrated the dangers of electing leaders whose personal character problems create ongoing vulnerabilities to political attack and distraction. No matter how talented or well-intentioned such leaders might be, their personal issues inevitably become public problems that consume time and attention that should be devoted to governance. The Clinton years also revealed the limitations of the American political system's ability to hold powerful figures accountable for misconduct that falls short of clearly impeachable offenses. Clinton survived his presidency despite engaging in behavior that would have ended the careers of less powerful people, suggesting that different standards apply to those at the highest levels of government. Perhaps most troubling, Clinton's presidency normalized a level of scandal and controversy that previous generations would have found unacceptable in their leaders. The constant investigations, allegations, and revelations became so routine that Americans began to expect them as simply part of the political landscape. By the time Clinton left office in January 2001, he had fundamentally changed American politics in ways that extended far beyond his specific policy achievements. He had shown that a president could survive almost any personal scandal through skillful political maneuvering and attack strategies. He had demonstrated that the American people would tolerate extraordinary levels of misconduct by their leaders, as long as the economy was strong and their personal lives were comfortable. But he had also shown the costs of such tolerance: a degraded political culture, increased cynicism about government and politicians, and the normalization of behavior that undermined the dignity and integrity of democratic institutions. The boy from Hope, Arkansas, who had dreamed of greatness since shaking hands with John F. Kennedy, had achieved his goal of reaching the presidency and had survived to serve 2 full terms. But the price of that survival was measured not just in personal humiliation and legal fees, but in the broader damage to American political culture and public trust in democratic institutions. Bill Clinton's presidency was a case study in the complex relationship between personal character and public leadership, a reminder that in a democracy, the two cannot be separated indefinitely. His extraordinary political gifts allowed him to overcome scandals that would have destroyed less skilled politicians, but those same scandals prevented him from achieving the transformative presidency that his talents might otherwise have made possible. In the end, Clinton's legacy is that of a president who achieved less than he might have because he could never escape the consequences of who he was: his appetites, his poor judgment, his willingness to bend truth and rules when it served his purposes. All of these created a constant undertow of controversy that pulled him away from the higher purposes that should define presidential leadership. The most powerful office in the world requires not just political skill and policy knowledge, but also personal integrity and moral authority. Clinton possessed the former qualities in abundance, but his deficits in the latter areas limited his effectiveness and tarnished his historical reputation. And so we return to where we began: a blue dress in a hotel room, federal agents, and a president about to discover that some lies are too big to survive. The Monica Lewinsky scandal was not an aberration in Clinton's presidency. It was the inevitable result of patterns of behavior that had been established long before he ever reached the White House. The scandal revealed not just Clinton's personal weaknesses, but the broader vulnerabilities of American democratic institutions when they are led by people who prioritize their own survival over the integrity of the system they are sworn to protect. Clinton survived his presidency, but American politics may never fully recover from the precedents he established. and the standards he lowered. And yet, even as Clinton was serving out his final months in office, battling to preserve whatever remained of his historical legacy, he was still finding new ways to create controversy and raise questions about his judgment. The final chapter of Clinton's scandal-plagued presidency came in the form of his presidential pardons, a constitutional power that allows presidents to forgive federal crimes without any oversight or review. Most presidents use this power sparingly and carefully, pardoning individuals who have clearly demonstrated rehabilitation or who were victims of prosecutorial overreach. Clinton, however, approached presidential pardons the same way he approached everything else, as an opportunity to reward friends, settle scores, and advance his own interests, regardless of how his actions might appear to the public or affect the integrity of the justice system. On his final day in office, January 2001, Clinton issued 140 presidential pardons and 36 commutations, more than any president had issued in a single day since Harry Truman. The sheer number of last-minute pardons was unprecedented, but it was the specific individuals Clinton chose to pardon that created the most controversy. The most shocking pardon went to Mark Rich, a billionaire commodities trader who had fled the United States in 1983 to avoid prosecution for tax evasion, wire fraud, racketeering, and trading with Iran during the hostage crisis. Rich had been living in Switzerland as a fugitive from American justice for nearly 2 decades, and his crimes were so serious that he was on the FBI's most wanted list. Rich was not the kind of person who typically received presidential pardons. He had never expressed remorse for his crimes, never cooperated with prosecutors, and never served a day in prison. He was a wealthy fugitive who had used his fortune to live comfortably in exile while thumbing his nose at American law enforcement. But Rich had something that Clinton valued more than justice: connections and money. Rich's ex-wife, Denise Rich, had become a major Democratic donor and a personal friend of Bill and Hillary Clinton. She had contributed more than $1 million to Democratic campaigns and causes, including $70,000 to Hillary's Senate campaign and $450,000 to the Clinton Presidential Library Fund. Denise Rich had also hired Jack Quinn, Clinton's former White House counsel, to lobby for her ex-husband's pardon. Quinn had bypassed the normal Justice Department review process and appealed directly to Clinton, arguing that Rich deserved a pardon because he had been unfairly targeted by prosecutors. The Mark Rich pardon created an immediate firestorm of criticism from both Democrats and Republicans. Even Clinton's own Justice Department had opposed the pardon, arguing that Rich hadn't met any of the normal criteria for presidential clemency. The pardon appeared to be nothing more than a reward for political donations, a final example of Clinton's willingness to sell access and favors to the highest bidder. But the Rich pardon was just the most egregious example of Clinton's questionable use of the presidential pardon power. He also pardoned his half-brother Roger Clinton, who had been convicted of drug charges, Susan McDougal, his Whitewater partner who had refused to testify against him, and several other individuals with personal or political connections to the Clinton family. The pattern of Clinton's pardons suggested that justice was for sale in the final days of his presidency, available to anyone with enough money or political influence to purchase clemency. It was a fitting end to a presidency that had been marked by constant questions about Clinton's willingness to use his office for personal benefit. The pardon controversy followed Clinton into his post-presidency, becoming yet another scandal that he would have to defend and explain for years to come. Congressional hearings were held, criminal investigations were launched, and Clinton's already damaged reputation suffered further harm. But perhaps more significantly, the pardon controversy revealed something important about Clinton's character that had been evident throughout his presidency, but had never been stated so clearly. He genuinely didn't seem to understand why people were upset by his behavior. In Clinton's mind, he had done nothing wrong by pardoning Mark Rich. He had used his constitutional authority to grant clemency to someone whose case had been brought to his attention by people he trusted. The fact that those people had given him money or political support was irrelevant. He would have made the same decision based purely on the merits of the case. This inability to understand how his actions appeared to others, this blindness to the ethical implications of his behavior, had been a constant theme throughout Clinton's presidency. He seemed genuinely surprised when people questioned his judgment, hurt when they suggested his motives were impure, confused when they failed to accept his explanations at face value. It was as if Clinton lived in a parallel universe where his intentions were always pure, his actions always justified, and his critics always motivated by partisan hatred rather than legitimate concerns about his conduct. This self-justifying worldview allowed him to sleep at night despite the chaos and controversy that constantly surrounded him. But it also prevented him from learning from his mistakes or changing his behavior in ways that might have made him a more effective president. Clinton never seemed to internalize the lessons of his scandals, never appeared to understand that his personal conduct was undermining his ability to lead and govern effectively. Even as Clinton was preparing to leave office, he was already planning his post-presidential career in ways that would create new controversies and raise new questions about his judgment and priorities. He established the Clinton Foundation, ostensibly a charitable organization focused on global health and development issues, but one that would later be criticized for accepting donations from foreign governments and wealthy individuals who seemed to be purchasing access to the former president. Clinton also began giving paid speeches to corporations, foreign governments, and other organizations, commanding fees of hundreds of thousands of dollars per appearance. While former presidents had always been able to earn money from speaking engagements, Clinton's approach was more aggressive and less discriminating than his predecessors. Clinton seemed willing to speak to almost anyone who could afford his fees, regardless of their reputation or the potential conflicts of interest that might arise. He gave speeches to Russian oligarchs, Middle Eastern governments, and Wall Street firms that were under investigation by federal regulators. The speaking fees created particular problems when Hillary Clinton became Secretary of State in 2009 and later ran for president in 2016. Bill's financial relationships with foreign governments and corporations raised questions about whether Hillary's official actions were influenced by payments to her husband. But even these future controversies were consistent with the pattern Clinton had established during his presidency, an apparent inability to understand or care about how his actions might create conflicts of interest or undermine public trust in democratic institutions. The tragedy of Clinton's presidency is not just that he failed to achieve his full potential as a leader, but that he seemed incapable of understanding why his personal conduct mattered to his effectiveness as president. He appeared to genuinely believe that as long as he was competent at the technical aspects of governing, his personal behavior was irrelevant to his public responsibilities. This fundamental misunderstanding of presidential leadership had consequences that extended far beyond Clinton's own presidency. By normalizing scandal and controversy, by demonstrating that presidents could survive almost any personal misconduct through skillful political maneuvering, Clinton changed public expectations about presidential behavior in ways that continue to influence American politics today. Future politicians learned from Clinton's example that scandal survival was possible, that attacking accusers was effective, that passing language could provide legal protection, and that the American people would ultimately forgive almost any personal failing if the economy was strong and their own lives were comfortable. These lessons have been applied by politicians of both parties in subsequent decades, contributing to a political culture where scandal is routine, where trust in government is low, and where personal character is often dismissed as irrelevant to political leadership. Clinton's presidency also demonstrated the limitations of the American political system's ability to hold powerful figures accountable for misconduct that falls short of clearly criminal behavior. The impeachment process, designed for cases of serious abuse of presidential power, proved inadequate for dealing with personal misconduct that undermined presidential effectiveness without necessarily constituting high crimes and misdemeanors. The result was a system where presidents could engage in behavior that would end the careers of ordinary citizens, face minimal consequences for their actions, and continue to exercise enormous power despite having demonstrated serious character flaws and poor judgment. Perhaps most troubling, Clinton's presidency showed how personal scandal could become a form of political entertainment, with the media and the public becoming fascinated by the salacious details of presidential misconduct, rather than focusing on the substantive policy issues that actually affected their lives. The Monica Lewinsky scandal, in particular, became a form of national soap opera, with Americans tuning in daily to learn the latest developments in the president's sex life rather than paying attention to important debates about healthcare, education, foreign policy, or other issues that had real consequences for their future. This transformation of political scandal into entertainment had lasting effects on American political culture, contributing to the celebrity-obsessed, scandal-focused media environment that continues to shape political coverage today. The Clinton presidency also revealed the gendered dimensions of political scandal, showing how women involved in scandals with powerful men often pay a higher price than the men themselves. Monica Lewinsky became a global punchline, her life and career destroyed by her relationship with Clinton, while Clinton survived to become a respected elder statesman and wealthy celebrity. The differential treatment of Clinton and Lewinsky reflected broader cultural attitudes about power, sexuality and gender that the scandal both exposed and reinforced. Clinton was seen as a powerful man who had made a mistake, while Lewinsky was seen as a young woman who had seduced or entrapped him. These attitudes were not just unfair to Lewinsky personally, but they also sent broader messages about how society views relationships between powerful men and the women who work for them. The Clinton-Lewinsky scandal normalized the idea that such relationships were primarily the responsibility of the women involved rather than the powerful men who initiated them. The long-term consequences of the Clinton presidency are still being felt in American politics today. The precedents he set for scandal management, the standards he lowered for presidential behavior, and the political techniques he pioneered continue to influence how politicians operate and how the public responds to political controversy. Clinton's ability to survive his scandals through attack strategies, legal maneuvering and political skill created a template that subsequent politicians have followed when facing their own controversies. The Clinton model of scandal response has become standard operating procedure for politicians of both parties. But while this approach may be effective for individual political survival, it has contributed to a broader degradation of political discourse and public trust in government institutions. When politicians routinely attack their accusers, pass language to avoid accountability, and prioritize political survival over truth and transparency, the entire political system suffers. The Clinton presidency also demonstrated how personal character flaws in leaders can have national security implications. Clinton's need to manage his various scandals consumed enormous amounts of time and attention that should have been devoted to governing, potentially contributing to missed opportunities to address emerging threats like terrorism. The distractions created by Clinton's personal conduct may have prevented his administration from focusing adequately on the growing threat from Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations, though it's impossible to know whether more focused attention would have prevented the September 11 attacks that occurred early in his successor's presidency. What is clear is that Clinton's scandals created a climate of political polarization and distrust that made it more difficult for the government to respond effectively to national challenges. When a significant portion of the population views the president as fundamentally dishonest and untrustworthy, it becomes harder to build the national consensus necessary to address complex problems. The Clinton years also showed how scandal can become self-perpetuating, with each controversy creating new opportunities for political enemies to investigate and attack. Clinton's pattern of questionable behavior gave his opponents ammunition for constant attacks, while his responses to those attacks often created new controversies that required additional defensive measures. This cycle of scandal and response consumed enormous resources and attention throughout Clinton's presidency, distracting from policy debates and governance in ways that ultimately served no one's interests except those of Clinton's political enemies. In retrospect, Clinton's presidency represents a missed opportunity for American leadership during a crucial period in world history. The end of the Cold War, the rise of globalization, the emergence of new technologies, and the beginning of new security threats all required thoughtful, sustained attention from American leaders. Clinton possessed many of the qualities necessary to provide such leadership: intelligence, policy knowledge, political skill, and personal charisma. But his personal conduct created constant distractions that prevented him from fully utilizing these gifts in service of the country. The ultimate tragedy of the Clinton presidency is not that he was a bad president, but that he could have been a great one if he had possessed the personal discipline and moral authority to match his political talents. His scandals didn't just damage his own reputation, they deprived the country of the kind of focused, visionary leadership that the times demanded. As Clinton boarded Air Force One for the final time as president on January 2001, he left behind a complex legacy that continues to influence American politics and culture today. He had survived 8 years of constant scandal and controversy, demonstrated remarkable political resilience, and presided over a period of peace and prosperity. But he had also normalized a level of scandal and controversy that previous generations would have found unacceptable in their leaders, contributed to increased cynicism about government and politicians, and missed opportunities to address long-term challenges facing the country. The boy from Hope, Arkansas, who had dreamed of greatness since meeting John F. Kennedy, had achieved his goal of reaching the presidency and serving 2 full terms. But the price of that achievement, measured in damaged institutions, degraded political culture, and missed opportunities for national progress, was far higher than it needed to be. Clinton's story remains a cautionary tale about the relationship between personal character and public leadership, a reminder that in a democracy, the two cannot be separated indefinitely. His extraordinary political gifts allowed him to overcome scandals that would have destroyed less skilled politicians, but those same scandals prevented him from achieving the transformative presidency that his talents might otherwise have made possible. And somewhere in the quiet moments after leaving office, as Clinton began planning the next phase of his career, he carried with him the knowledge that he had been both the most successful and the most scandal-plagued president of his generation. He had survived, but survival is not the same as success, and political skill is no substitute for the moral authority that true leadership requires. The blue dress that started our story, the phone call that shattered a presidency, the lies that nearly brought down the most powerful man in the world, all of it had become history. But the lessons of the Clinton years, both positive and negative, would continue to shape American politics for generations to come, a reminder that in democracy, character matters as much as competence, and integrity is as important as intelligence in the leaders we choose to follow.